Push this button so the green light is on.
Oh, the push button. Okay, so that's on. Okay. Gotcha.
Talk, you gotta hit it. And then when you
Jonathan, you're in Philadelphia?
Yep, I am. Yeah. And where are you based?
Princeton.
In Princeton.
Yep.
My daughter went to Princeton in the late '80s. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I know it. I visited the place. And hi, nice to meet you, sir. Yeah. Okay. So,
Thank you.
I think you may be sitting.
It's all seats.
Yeah. They're not big. The two seats are reserved for Katie Bentley and son. Yeah. Pardon me? Oh, they're reserved. Okay.
Yeah, they're sitting here. Rebecca's sitting there.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for allowing me to do it. Last night I was trying to do 5 minutes on each. Brain.
I was surprised that this is a full 2 hour. Yeah.
Those cross-outs.
I started trying to get this document. Well, that's right. I mean, I think it's really disconcerting that since 2000, no policy program, but the roll has been 4%.
Nice to meet you.
Probably going to be completely reprogrammed.
So I'm changing my settings. Ringtones for it. Yeah, you'll change it.
So we were the two guys who requested kind of review more information on all of this. Study was actually done.
Did you ever see this piece?
From Covington.
you made a couple references to, the media controversy.
Yeah.
This should be mandatory. I'm going to give you your own copy. This is the actual Wall Street Journal reporter and Forbes Media Critic. Forbes Media Critic was a pretty conservative media. This reviewed all the journalism and showed what a crock
The first allegations
yeah,
that
yeah,
led to
yeah,
welfare
yeah.
reform.
And of course tracked it into Congress and showed that it all was later refuted, but the damage was done. But that actually this is a journalism critique of what was written, and just how shoddy and parallels with the Globe. Anyone who reads the Globe stuff, I hand this out because this is history. That's not too far. This is like 15 years ago. This is not in the 19th century.
Yeah, Rich and I were just talking about this. The over-medication issue is certainly sensationalistic. What I say in my testimony is, you got to be careful to completely dismiss it, but there is this history of media reports.
But the question is, over-medication, even if that's true, but even if it's true, it's a wonderful, interesting medical phenomenon. But the bottom line is, does it affect Social Security decision making?
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
I mean, there's a disconnect.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. In today's hearing, we're going to review supplemental security income, or SSI, benefits for children. SSI provides monthly federal payments of up to $674 to 1.2 million low-income disabled children across the United States. In all, SSI provides about $9 billion in payments to children each year, averaging about $8,000 per child. That $9 billion nearly matches the amount taxpayers spend for welfare checks under the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And it's one of several reasons the Boston Globe published a series last year calling the Children's SSI program, quote, the other welfare, close quote. As that series detailed, and we'll hear today, SSI benefits for children are not only significant in size and expense, but they're also growing rapidly, with nearly a 50% rise in the number of children receiving payments over the last decade. This growth has been driven by mental and behavioral impairments, which include attention deficit, hyperactive disorder, autism, learning disabilities, and speech and language delays. Boys are twice as likely to receive monthly disability payments as girls, and over 60% of children on SSI at age 18 continue collecting payments as adults over a period that can span decades. Especially troubling in the Boston Globe series were allegations that some children are being placed on dangerous psychotropic medications in order to increase their chances of qualifying for SSI checks. That's one reason why I, along with our colleague Congressman Richie Neal from Massachusetts, who's joined us today, and Senators Susan Collins, Tom Carper, and Scott Brown asked the Government Accountability Office to review this program. From GAO's preliminary findings, we've already learned that medication is merely one factor of many that are used to make a determination. GAO's review goes on to cover a broader array of issues important to the oversight role of this subcommittee, including trends for disabilities under which children qualify, the role of medical evidence in determining eligibility, and SSA reevaluations of children in the years after they start collecting benefits. We're privileged to be joined by Katie and Will Bentley of Covington, Kentucky, part of the congressional district I'm honored to represent. Will is a child who receives SSI benefits. We need to keep the interest of children like Will and their families squarely in mind as we consider ways to how to improve this program and how it serves them. A review of the hearing's testimony reveals all of our witnesses today propose changes in how SSI works with a common goal of doing a better job helping children and families overcome the disabling conditions that led them to apply for SSI in the first place. For example, as several experts have noted, SSI today offers monthly checks without any requirement that benefits be spent on helping the child overcome his or her disability. Some question whether that may create a financial disincentive to overcoming the disability because that would mean the checks come to an end. Other recommendations focus on expecting teenagers on SSI to remain in school in order to qualify for payments. A disturbing 30% of older teens on SSI drop out of school, which only adds to the barriers they face in going to work and leading productive lives. Still, other recommendations go to the basic architecture of the SSI program, a largely federal program that since its inception in the 1970s has spent $160 billion while being run from the Social Security Administration headquarters in Baltimore. We look forward to all of the testimony today and working with our colleagues across the aisle to improve how this program serves the children and families who depend on it, as well as ensuring that the program efficiently and effectively uses taxpayer dollars. One of the things that I would like to emphasize in this hearing, and my friend and ranking member Lloyd Doggett and I have worked very hard during the course of this Congress so far in addressing the programs that we have, is to look at processes. In many cases, the processes within the federal government are broken. Information systems don't communicate with one another. It's often difficult to identify data that's helpful in helping the people that are being served by the safety net, and to find errors inside of that. And that's part of the underlying motivation as we go forward in this hearing today. We're here to gather facts, to get information, and hopefully to gain insights in how to better improve that program, to improve the process, and to better serve both our taxpayers and recipients of the benefits. Without objection, each member will have the opportunity to submit a written statement and have it included in the record at this point as well. And with that, I'll now defer to my friend Lloyd Doggett from Texas, the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And the objective that you mentioned in your testimony, or in your opening statement, of helping families deal with these great challenges that they encounter with a child or children with disabilities is a shared goal that we have. And seeing that the Supplemental Security Income Program, or SSI, is administered in an efficient and effective way is a goal that we share. It's one of the reasons that Mr. Neal and others joined to ask the Government Accountability Office to take a look at the reports that were raised by this Boston Globe study. On the other hand, when we have studied unemployment, we have had some members almost suggest that the main problem with unemployment is the unemployed, and that they can be blamed for the situation. And we ought not to follow a course along those lines as it relates to families with disabilities. SSI assist families who are dealing with a child with a disability, physical, mental, or both. And only about 1/10 of the children in the country with such disabilities receive SSI, and the benefits amount to about $600 a month. These are benefits that help offset the cost of caring for severely disabled children. SSI is particularly important in my home state of Texas, where we have so many poor children generally, and particularly poor disabled children, about 130,000 in the state who are receiving benefits. Two such children live near where I do in Central Texas in Bastrop County, Tyler and Noah Roberts. They're 5-year-old twins. When you look at their photos, you see two very beautiful little boys, but they are little boys who have severe autism. One is nonverbal and engages in behaviors like flapping his arms, spinning, and throwing tantrums. The other is verbal but has severe anxiety, intestinal, and sensory problems. These are serious conditions that have greatly impeded their mother's ability to maintain a regular work schedule, and she depends on SSI to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. I have seen situations just like this in the work that my wife has done. Before I came to Congress, she headed an early intervention program working with infants and very young children who had severe disabilities across the Texas Hill Country. This is not an isolated case. It is an example of the challenges that families face that we need to be assisting, not blaming them for the problem that they have. There has been some growth in the SSI program since 2001, largely in a response to the growing number of children that live in poverty in this country. But just because more families like the Roberts are receiving SSI benefits to help raise their children with autism and other significant problems doesn't mean they should be targeted for cuts. During the last decade, almost 5 million more children have fallen below the poverty line. One could reasonably assume that the increase would have an impact on a program designed to help low-income families with disabled children. While we hear suggestions that the program has changed, the Congressional Research Service concludes that the rate of poverty on SSI as a percentage of children living in poverty is about the same now as it was in 2001. Further, we have increased efforts to identify childhood disabilities. The Center for Economic and Policy Research found that the number of children receiving screening and diagnostic services under Medicaid rose from a little over 5 million to over 20 million children from 1998 to 2008. Nevertheless, there has not been an increase in SSI approval rates for children with mental impairments. According to the Social Security Administration, the percentage has actually dropped from 2001 to 2010. There are a number of steps that we can and should take to improve the administration of SSI, and I hope we'll explore those in the hearing. First, I think Congress needs to make good on its pledge to provide adequate resources to conduct continuing disability reviews to ensure that SSI recipients maintain their eligibility for services. And President Obama's administration has nearly doubled the number of those reviews compared to the last year of President Bush. Second, if we are serious about improving outcomes for children receiving SSI, I look forward to discussing other supports we can offer these families as they work with their children and they seek employment opportunities for unemployed disabled children. We are, as the chairman indicated, joined by the Bentley family, by Katie and her son Will, who receive SSI. They are accompanying Jonathan Stein, who is testifying. Despite the severe impairments that Will faces, Ms. Bentley and her husband were reluctant, as many families are, to even apply for SSI. They wanted to support Will on their own. But after Ms. Bentley had to close her business to care for Will, the financial burden was heavy, and she took the benefits that she is entitled to take. Since Will has been receiving these benefits, his outcomes have improved remarkably. According to Ms. Bentley, the life-altering value of SSI is worth so much more than its monetary value. It's truly priceless, in her words. Mr. Chairman, we can all agree on the need to improve and strengthen SSI outcomes, and I look forward to working with you on reforms, but let's reject any direct cuts in assistance to the disabled in the name of helping them. However great our nation's fiscal challenges may be, we ought not to balance the budget on the backs of disabled children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doggett. We're also pleased to be joined by our colleague on the Ways and Means Committee, Representative Richie Neal of Massachusetts, who joined me and others in requesting the GAO review, showing concerns over families and how they about how they access SSI benefits for children and ultimately how the program might be improved. Mr. Neal, do you have any comments before we
Thank you,
hear
Mr.
from our
Chairman.
witnesses?
Just a couple of thoughts, if I could, just a brief statement, and I find myself in agreement with what you said and with what Mr. Doggett said. I think that's the path forward, to have a deliberative effort here. I want to thank you first for allowing me to give some brief opening comments, even though I'm not a member of the subcommittee. And I'm very pleased that the subcommittee, through you and Mr. Doggett, have called the hearing to examine the state of SSI in America. SSI for Children is a program that's been brought to my attention, as well as to New Englanders, by an illuminating and powerful three-piece and three-part series by Patricia Wynn of the Boston Globe, but also anecdotally by educators, parents, and healthcare professionals in Springfield, Holyoke, and other cities and towns in Massachusetts with high populations of SSI recipients. The Globe map that I would encourage all of us to take a look at, that demonstrated a clear concentration of SSI recipients in the older cities of Massachusetts, speaks to the issues that you've raised and the issues that Mr. Doggett have raised. But I've also believed that the role of the federal government is to aid the most vulnerable amongst us. The SSI program was created to do just that, originally to provide financial support for children with severe physical disabilities, and to evolve as our healthcare system has evolved to support children who suffer from severe behavioral and mental health issues as well. I have met with the Social Security Administration and the administrator, Michael Astrew, about my concerns with SSI. I've requested the administration, meaning President Obama as well as SSI administrators, and I would suggest to this committee that we include an Institute of Medicine study to examine the concentration of SSI recipients in the old cities of Massachusetts. And why? Simply to get to the bottom of the issue as to the role that the program plays in helping those who need it, and to avoid the potential for stigmatizing children when it becomes the first option that is suggested from health professionals. I've asked the GAO, along with the members of the subcommittee, to conduct an objective and balanced analysis of the SSI program and to specifically look into provocative topics like suspected overprescribing of medications. and the lack of a periodic review of the healthcare progress for children. And I think everybody would agree with that there is not a system that reviews sufficiently the progress that children might be making. I'm interested in what the report concludes. You should know I have drawn no conclusions and would be anxious to hear from the Institute of Medicine. Social Security Administrator has indicated that that study would cost about $10 million. I think that is a reasonable expenditure so that we might determine how we go forward. Supplemental security income for children is an important program for the very vulnerable and neediest of the population. But oversight of the program is necessary as well to ensure that its mission in assisting those vulnerable children remain intact while abuse might be examined, identified, and where possible, eliminated. I also want to emphasize that I have not, again, drawn any conclusions, but I want to tell you the series that the Boston Globe outlined is a powerful reminder of the responsibility that we have to these children. And I thank you and Mr. Doggett for allowing me to participate this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Before we move on to our testimony, I'd like to remind each of our witnesses that they need to limit your oral statements to no longer than 5 minutes. However, without objection, all of the written testimony will be made part of the permanent record. On our panel this morning, we'll be hearing from Daniel Bertoni, Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, Richard Burkhauser, Professor, Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell University. Dr. Burkhauser will also be testifying before another subcommittee this morning, and so will need to leave before the end of the hearing, but we certainly appreciate his taking the time to join us and including your testimony in the record. We're also joined by David Wittenberg, Senior Researcher from Mathematica Policy Research, Jonathan Stein, General Counsel to Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and also representing the SSI Coalition for Children and Families, and Elizabeth Roberts, a child and adolescent psychiatrist joining us from Murrieta, California. Mr. Bertoni, please proceed with your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Doggett, Mr. Neal, members of the subcommittee, good morning. I'm pleased to discuss our preliminary observations on children with mental impairments in the Supplemental Security Income
Could you
Program.
make sure that the light's on there?
It's on. I'm just
Okay,
maybe
maybe
not
it's the
close
mic
enough.
needs to be a little closer. Thank you.
In 2010, SSA paid over $9 billion in SSI benefits to more than 1.2 million children. In prior work, we reported that the number of children on SSI had increased substantially, due in part to program changes that expanded eligibility for those with mental impairments. And despite modifications intended to address this growth, the number of children on SSI with such impairments has continued to rise. My testimony draws on our ongoing work and presents our observations on trends in the rate of children receiving SSI, the role medical and non-medical information plays in the disability decision process, and steps SSA has taken to review the continued eligibility of children. In summary, we found that the number of children applying for SSI benefits due to mental impairments increased 60% over the last decade, and such cases now comprise a growing majority of all child beneficiaries. Moreover, between fiscal years 2000 and 2010, the number of children found eligible for benefits increased for almost every mental impairment category, with the most prevalent being ADHD, speech and language delays, and autism. However, over the last decade, the average allowance rate for all children with mental impairments has held steady at about 46%. Several factors may have contributed to trends in the roles, including agency and advocate outreach, increased diagnoses of certain mental impairments, and the number of children living in poverty. However, it's unclear how any single factor or combination of factors has driven such trends. During our field work, DDS examiners noted that they rely on a combination of medical and non-medical information, such as treatment records, prescribed medications, school records, and teacher assessments in determining a child's eligibility. In short, the decision is based on the totality of information rather than any one piece in isolation. Examiners obtain evidence such as psychological tests and physician's notes to assess children with alleged mental impairments, and when such evidence is inconclusive, they may purchase an independent consultative exam for the child. In regard to the role of prescription medication, DDS examiners in various locations told us it is generally given no more weight than any other information, and in some cases, if medication improves functioning, it can be a factor in denying a claim. However, certain field offices acknowledge that some parents may believe that medicating their children will improve their likelihood of receiving benefits. And going forward, we plan to conduct an in-depth case file review to assess the relative weight medication and other evidence plays in SSI decisions. In regard to non-medical information, we found that some DDSs face challenges in obtaining school records and teacher assessments, which can be a critical source of information for assessing a child's functioning over time, partly due to the schools' and teachers' reluctance to complete such assessments. And finally, although SSA is required to periodically conduct continuing disability reviews, or CDRs, of children on the rolls, such reviews decreased substantially over the last decade, from more than 200,000 to about 126,000. And those for children with mental impairments decreased from 84,000 to only 13,000 last year. We identified over 400,000 child SSI cases with mental impairments that were overdue for a CDR, with thousands of cases exceeding their scheduled dates by several years. Of the CDRs SSA did conduct last year, the average benefit cessation rate was 24%, with personality disorders and speech and language delays having a higher rates of rescission at 34% and 33% respectively. SSA has acknowledged the importance of conducting CDRs, but has primarily attributed its failure to do all required reviews to resource constraints and competing workloads. Thus, the program continues to be exposed to substantial overpayments. The recently enacted Budget Control Act of 2011 authorizes additional funding for SSA to do more CDRs and SSI redeterminations, and the agency is currently assessing how it will use such funding should it be appropriated. Thus, it is not yet known whether SSA will use this funding to do additional childhood CDRs or target its efforts toward those mental impairments with the highest potential cessation rates as a means of best leveraging its limited resources. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bertoni. Dr. Burkhauser, please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity to submit a summary of my research on the SSI Disabled Children's Program contained in my new book with Mary Daly. In 1974, the SSI Disabled Children's Program provided benefits to a small subpopulation of poor families with age-eligible children. Only about 10 per thousand poor children received such benefits. Program caseloads grew modestly to about 20 per thousand by 1989, but between then and 1996, the number more than tripled to 65 per thousand, fell modestly for 1 year, and then increased to 80 per thousand in 2007. Based on our reading of the evidence, this dramatic growth is not the result of a growing health epidemic among poor children, but rather the consequence of several policy decisions that have turned a modest program for disabled children into a more general welfare program that in large part serves the same poor single mothers in the TANF population. 71% of SSI families are headed by single mothers or other non-two-parent families. Increasingly, their children have medical conditions that are difficult to objectively measure and are coming onto the SSI program via increasingly subjective evaluations by SSA gatekeepers. So why have SSI caseloads risen? Is it a health epidemic? While it is difficult to obtain information on the underlying health of poor children, we find no evidence of worsening health in this population. While the number of poor children has increased, the number of children in that population receiving SSI benefits has increased even faster, hence the 400% growth in their share among poor children previously mentioned. Is it program policy factors? I believe it is, and I focus on three policy effects. The first is TANF and SSI interactions. The typical SSI applicant family is headed by a poor single mother who is eligible for TANF. Because SSI benefits are larger than TANF benefits and have no work requirements, it is in the interest of these single mothers to apply, and economists have shown that the greater the difference, the more likely they are to do so. States also have an incentive to move their TANF families to the SSI program, thus cost shifting their payments to the federal government. This becomes a more realistic option the lower the standard for establishing SSI eligibility and the more subjective SSI's eligibility decisions are. So here's where the second change comes in. Eligibility standards were both lower and made more subjective in the wake of the Zebley case, and this explains much of the increase in SSI caseloads between '89 and '96. As part of welfare reform, Congress modified definitions of disability for children, creating a new stricter standard. This reduced caseloads per child, but only for 1 year. Here's where the third change comes in. That is the way SSI gatekeepers interpret these rules. The outcome of applying more subjective criteria to determine eligibility can be seen in the percentage of SSI awards by two conditions: mental retardation and other mental conditions. These two conditions represent extremes between medically measurable and more subjectively determined outcomes. In '83, approximately 37% of new beneficiaries qualified based on mental retardation. and only 5% had other mental conditions. Today, over 55% of new beneficiaries claim other mental conditions. In sum, the research findings provide plausible evidence that SSI program growth has primarily been driven by policy changes rather than the declining health of poor children. But what policy caused, new policies can change, but only if they are fundamental changes. The SSI program closely resembles more general welfare programs and thus can be changed using many of the same principles applied in moving from AFDC to TANF. This would mean moving SSI from the federal government to the states. This devolution would, like TANF, hold states accountable to federal guidelines regarding outcomes of children with disabilities. Like TANF, SSI could be funded by block grants, and states could be asked to comply with broader goals. Devolution to the states would also solve three major problems with the current program. First, on equity grounds, placing responsibility for all welfare families with the states would reduce the difference in treatment of poor families based on the often subjective decision of whether their children meet the SSI standards. Second, devolving the SSI program to the states would limit state incentives to shift the cost of managing welfare caseloads to federal government through the SSI. And third, devolution of the states, who have far more experience than SSA in transitioning poor single mothers into the workforce, would allow them and eventually their disabled children the opportunity to work after the children are off the SSI children's rolls. Thank you for the opportunity for speaking to you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burkhauser. Dr. Wittenberg, if you could give your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Dodgett, and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to testify on how we can improve efforts to provide supports to child SSI recipients. I have written several reports about the outcomes of these youth, and I will make 3 points about this program related to issues raised in recent media reports, including the Boston Globe series, and conclude with 2 approaches for possible reform. The first point is about the importance of the Child SSI program as an anti-poverty tool. A key indicator of the program's effect on poverty is that, on average, the child's SSI benefit check currently accounts for approximately half of the income of the family. A second related point is about the strong individual and state incentives that encourage families to apply for SSI over existing state welfare programs like TANF. This point echoes Dr. Burkhauser's point just made, that families might be enticed to apply for SSI on behalf of their child because the federal SSI benefit on average is $200 larger than state TANF benefits. Because TANF is funded by a block grant, states can also financially gain because every dollar saved by a transfer of a TANF recipient to SSI remains within the state. For these reasons, a low-income parent who has a child with even a moderate disability has a financial incentive to apply for SSI and could even be encouraged to do so by a state worker. The caseload trends illustrate this gradual federalization. Since 1989, child SSI caseloads have increased by 350%, while the corresponding state welfare caseloads have dropped by more than 50%. There is evidence of direct transitions across the programs. A key question is whether this movement increasingly towards using child SSI supports for low-income families is appropriate. This question leads to my third point, which is the most important point of my testimony and is illustrated on the slide above. A major concern is the program's effects on the outcomes of young adults. And this slide shows between the ages of 19 to 23, former child SSI recipients reported, first of all, substantial dropout rates. 2 in 5 did not have a high school diploma and were not actively attending school. Low employment rates. Almost 4 in 5 were not currently working. Most disconcerting, high arrest rates. 1 in 5 had been arrested. And unfortunately, these arrest trends are consistent with other reports that indicate 30 to 50% of incarcerated youth with disabilities that could qualify them for other services. Finally, a reliance on SSI benefits as a long-term option. Just over 3 in 5 were receiving SSI after age 18. Taken together, these poor outcomes suggest a need to rethink the current policies. Any approach, though, should balance the outcomes needed above with also providing income supports that keep low-income families out of poverty. One approach to reforming policy and to reverse the outcomes shown on this slide is to pilot the addition of education and/or work requirements for continuing SSI eligibility. This option maintains the current structure of the child program, but alters the potential adverse incentives children face regarding school and work. The infusion of education requirements would also make the Child SSI program more consistent with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which provides free and appropriate education services to youth with disabilities. A second, more ambitious approach is to look at the broader safety net and consolidate service delivery to more specifically meet the diverse needs of youth with disabilities and their families. This option is especially important given the fact that the line between TANF and SSI has become blurred. Improving program design requires a rethinking of existing programs and designing new approaches that should be tested to build a consensus on what works. Such rethinking could include local, state, federal, or even private providers who provide a more integrated set of reports. While we do know some information to approach the problem, the exact model for reform is not known at this time because it has not been tested, so we should not rush to a solution. Experimentation, however, can lead to innovation of promising practices, service delivery, and effective policy. For this reason, I suggest the use of congressional authority to invest in major demonstrations which will highlight models that could improve health and social outcomes and potentially save significant tax dollars. Failure to do so only delays our ability to develop policies to improve the lives of youth with disabilities. Youth are worth the investment, and the outcomes I outlined today indicate that we should be more aggressive in efforts to help them reach their full potential. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wittenberg. Mr. Stein, you may proceed.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Stein, General Counsel at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, where I have represented children with disabilities and their families for most of my 43 years of practice. CLS is a member of the SSI Coalition of Children and Families, 80 organizations that share the belief that SSI is a critical lifeline for children with severe disabilities, our nation's most vulnerable children and youth. I'd first like to introduce you all to Will Bentley, and his picture is there on the wall. Will is an 8-year-old boy who lives in Covington, Kentucky with his parents and sister. Nearly from birth, Will's parents knew something was wrong. Will was very slow in learning to speak and had trouble eating and drinking because he wasn't able to keep liquid in his mouth. His parents enrolled him in First Steps, Kentucky's early intervention program, where he learned to sign with his hands so that he could communicate with his family. At age 3, Will began to have frequent violent seizures. His diagnoses grew to include developmental delays, speech delays, sensory integration disorder, anxiety disorder, frequent bouts of depression, among others. Taking Will to all his needed medical and therapy appointments became a full-time job for his mother, Kate. Katie Bentley was forced to shut down all her small business to stay home and care for Will, and the family suffered a huge loss of income. In Katie's own words, quote, "My husband and I really wanted to support Will on our own, but we quickly learned that the dream we had of our own family would never become a reality. I surrendered my career, and we adapted our life so that Will's needs could be met. Before he was granted an SSI in 2010, we barely could even afford the gas to drive him to his therapies and appointments with his specialists. Now, SSI allows us to focus on Will's needs." And as she further says, quote, "At one time, Will was unable to do anything for himself. He couldn't even feed himself. Now he has learned to write his name, and a few days ago, Will learned to zip his own jacket and is even learning to read. The wealth of support that comes from SSI and Medicaid is a dream come true for us," says Katie Bentley. Helping children with severe disabilities like Will lead their fullest lives possible requires access to treatment and supportive services, as well as financial support to replace lost income when a parent must stay home to care for the child. SSI is a key ingredient to helping them get the care and support they need. Sensational and ill-informed media accounts, as in the Boston Globe and elsewhere, have relied almost entirely on anecdotal observations and half-truths. So let's instead consider some facts. Fact: only the most severely impaired children qualify for SSI.
fewer than 10% of all children in the nation with disabilities receive SSI. And this is because of the extraordinarily strict SSI disability standard, an objective standard, unlike Mr. Berghouse's characterization of it as subjective. Just 39% of children who apply are awarded SSI, a figure that has remained essentially unchanged for well over the past decade. Fact, SSI was established by Congress to aid children and adults with physical as well as mental impairments. As a nation, we've made great strides toward achieving parity between mental and physical disabilities. Any debate over whether mental impairments such as ADHD or autism are as, quote, legitimate, end quote, as physical disabilities represents a significant and shameful step backward. Fact, ADHD is a neurobehavioral disorder with clear medical diagnostic criteria recognized by the National Institutes of Health and a myriad of other respected research organizations. Only the most severe cases of ADHD qualify for SSI. Just 26% of children with ADHD who apply for SSI are approved. Thus, 3 out of every 4 children with ADHD are denied. And in fact, the allowance rate for ADHD has been declining in recent years. Fact, a prescription for medications would never, on its own, make a child eligible for SSI. In fact, being on medications can actually make a child less likely to be found eligible for SSI if they lessen the severity of the child's impairments. Moreover, SSA data show that children with ADHD who are taking medications are no more likely to be approved for SSI than those not taking medications. And in fact, there's nothing in the GAO report that shows a study to be contrary to that. We look forward to hearing, though, GAO's findings when it has completed its study and expect that they will match SSA's own findings. Fact, growth in the children's SSI program in recent years is due primarily to increasing poverty. As the number of poor children in this country has reached tragic new heights, over 16 million U.S. children now live in poverty versus 11 million a decade ago. More low-income children, obviously, are financially eligible for SSI. Yet, the share of children in poverty who receive SSI has remained unchanged for the past 10 years at 7.5%. And I am nearing my end, Mr. Chairman.
We're well
yeah.
past that.
Might you just give me one more minute?
No, if you could sum up briefly with one sentence.
Okay. I will be saying the following. I would urge the subcommittee not to take hasty action, to wait for the GAO study, and even seek a study from the Institute of Medicine or the Association of University Centers on Disability. And I would say, as I've said earlier, this is a critical lifeline for families like the Bentleys, and if any members of the subcommittee have any questions for Mrs. Bentley, who's sitting behind me to the right, she's also available to respond to questions. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Mr. Stein. I wish we had unlimited time for all of our witnesses. It's simply constrained within the overall schedule of the Congress today, and I'm personally looking forward to meeting with the Bentleys again after the hearing concludes. We're going to move on now to Dr. Roberts. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Davis, Mr. Doggett, for inviting me to speak today. As a child psychiatrist, I've treated hundreds of children who are receiving the supplemental security income. And what I've observed in the cases I've been treating is an alarming abuse of the SSI system. But more importantly, I've observed what a devastating effect the abuse of the SSI system can have on child and family. Because diagnosing a child with a psychiatric condition is based almost exclusively on the verbal report of the child's parent, it is easy for a doctor to arrive at the wrong conclusion. There are no blood tests, CAT scans, MRIs, SPECT scans, and what have you, that can accurately diagnose a mental disorder. The misdiagnosis of children with psychiatric conditions and the consequential over-medicating of these kids has become a problem of epidemic proportions in the United States. And when you add the financial incentive of getting your child diagnosed and treated with a mental illness, the pursuit of SSI benefits for children has become an irresistible attraction for poor families. If this abuse of SSI were only a waste of taxpayer dollars, that would be bad enough. But the fraudulent use of SSI is hurting children, both emotionally and physically. The best way I can think to elucidate this problem is to give you examples of children I've actually treated. In 2002, I met an 18-year-old girl who had been assigned to me at the Riverside County Mental Health Clinic for a psychiatric evaluation. For the purpose of this testimony, I'll refer to her as Sarah. Sarah explained to me that she was required by the ESSA to be re-evaluated if she wanted to continue to receive her benefit check. She told me that since she was 14, she'd been abusing every street drug imaginable: methamphetamine, cocaine, LSD, marijuana, alcohol, and others. It was at 14 that she started abusing drugs, and this is when her mother took her for an evaluation at the county mental health clinic. When she was high on speed, she was hyperactive and agitated. When she was drunk, she was depressed. She only experienced her mood symptoms while she was using or withdrawing from drugs. Prior to the time that Sarah started using drugs, she had no serious mood problems, aside from being belligerent and demanding with her mother. Regardless, her psychiatrist diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, and with this diagnosis, her mother was able to secure SSI benefits. And though she was prescribed psychiatric medications for her mood disorder, she told me she never took the medications consistently and usually refused them altogether. Furthermore, Sarah explained that she continued to abuse street drugs for the next 4 years. She described her own behaviors as defiant and rebellious and wild throughout those drug-soaked teen years from 14 to 18 years old. Sarah presented her history with pride and impunity. At 18, Sarah moved out of her mother's house, starting to cash and keep her SSI benefits of over $800 a month. I guess kids get more in California than they get elsewhere. Though she abused drugs excessively, she was an otherwise beautiful, physically healthy, able-bodied, trim, attractive, smart, Caucasian blonde girl. Sarah reported to me in this first session that she had established the practice of cashing her SSI check each month, checking into a cheap motel, buying up all the meth with the SSI funds that she could afford, and then she and her boyfriend would use drugs continuously until the money ran out. And when the motel evicted them for non-payment, they would sleep on the streets and panhandle for money until the next SSI check arrived. With the start of each month, Sarah and her boyfriend would cash the SSI check and repeat the same routine. When I confronted her with the fact that using her SSI funds to do drugs was destroying her own life, she stated that she didn't care and that she was having fun. She told me that in spite of the fact that she was perfectly capable of working, her bipolar diagnosis entitled her to the SSI money and that she had every intention of continuing to use that money to finance her drug use. When I pointed out to Sarah that people worked hard, paid their taxes to support programs such as SSI for the benefit of the truly needy, like Will Bentley, she responded by telling me people who work and pay taxes are chumps. Furthermore, I explained to her the abuse of SSI system was fraud. She went on to provide me with the following advice. If working people had half a brain, they'd figure out her scam and take advantage of the system as she had. I offered Sarah psychotherapy, vocational training, drug rehabilitation. She declined all of her our services at the county clinic, and including I offered her medications, prescriptions. She said she hadn't been taking them anyway, and she refused all our services. She asked that I please just simply complete her renewal application for the SSI benefits. I completed the application, providing the SSA evaluators with all the information I had gathered in this first meeting, and her benefits were denied.
Dr.
I'm
Roberts,
sorry.
I just
We're out
encourage you
of
to
time. I'm sorry,
wrap
I
up.
didn't notice.
Thank you. And we have the rest of your statement in the record as well for further review. I appreciate everybody's testimony. We're going to go ahead and move now to questions. In the testimony that we've heard today, it appears there are both short and long-run recommendations on how to help disabled children better prepare for adulthood, and recognizing that there's a wide range of needs within the population of children receiving SSI benefits. Mr. Bertoni, your testimony indicates that while mental impairments are the diagnosis for 2/3 of the children receiving SSI, the continuing disability reviews, or CDRs, needed to confirm children in this group remain eligible, or in this group to remain eligible, have dropped by 84% in the past decade. On page 21, you display a chart that shows how these reviews are years overdue for nearly all child recipients with mental impairments. Looking at the short run, Mr. Bertoni, of the trends involving children on SSI due to mental impairments, what does the evidence suggest SSA should be doing to better manage this program?
I think up at the front end, SSA should be concerned in looking at the rise in some of these impairments, especially, I think, in speech and language delay, which appears to have increased precipitously. Many of that impairment can be viewed as transient nature, likely to improve. But at the back end, much of their focus has been on age 18 redeterminations and low birth weight babies, about 87% of all CDRs. So we have 13% of all other CDRs that are looking at all other mental impairments. I think it would behoove the agency to sort of tease out some of these impairments that, number one, are growing in terms of raw numbers, and their own CDRs have shown to have fairly large or high cessation rates. Speech and language delay is about 33% cessation rate right now. So
you're saying, in effect, if I could just offer a possible example and tell me if I'm right or wrong, that a person who might have been a young person 3 or 4 years old was diagnosed with this, it's possible without the CDR, say coming at a reasonable time within a couple of years, could remain on SSI all the way until age 18 without any review.
Certainly. Right now, the caseload's up to 174,000 cases. And if they're only doing 13% of all mental impairments, I think it's fair to say that very few speech and language delay cases are being reviewed. And it's probably fair to say that many of those children are probably on the rolls well beyond a CDR that could possibly have ceased them.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wittenberg, the outcomes you describe in your research for older youth on SSI are terrible, quite frankly. No one would want that for their children. High rates of school dropout and unaddressed, low rates of work, training, or other positive activities. 2 questions, really. First, what should we do about that? And secondly, is the Social Security Administration, in your opinion, equipped to take the steps needed to improve the outcomes, or is this the type of effort that state agencies need to be involved in, as we saw with welfare reform?
Yeah, and that really gets to the heart of my testimony. I think that's an excellent question, Chairman Davis. I think if the short answer for what can SSA do about it is, I think looking into school and possibly work requirements for child SSI recipients as well as young adult SSI recipients to reorientate them around the concept of work is potentially an important step. But the bigger picture that I wanted to focus on is the appropriateness of the child SSI benefit and meeting all the needs, the diverse needs of the families. I think as you heard across all the testimony today, you've got a diverse spectrum of youth here. So when we talk about devolving to the state level, I think that's an interesting concept because that's where the services are provided to these youth. That's where schools are provided. That's where voc rehab is provided. That's where Medicaid is provided. So there's an interesting potential to bundle services. But I would stop short of saying we should go ahead and block grant that to states because at least in some of the experiences under TANF, states have not spent their money for other resources. So if you block grant to SSI, and TANF has been using SSI as the safety net, where does that go? That's why I suggest a more integrated approach that could occur at the state or other levels that might even include private providers, and that's why experimentation is really important.
Mr. Chairman, may I add to that answer, if I could respond to your question?
Sure, we just have a few seconds. But
yeah, sure. I mean, this whole idea of bad outcomes that Mr. Wittenberg refers to doesn't really ask the question, isn't it really not a surprise that there's a high unemployment rate, that disabled children, whether they're on SSI or not, are not going to be employed in great numbers or maybe dropping out of school. What Mr. Wittenberg is not doing is comparing those disabled kids on SSI with other disabled children. And don't they all share similar problems or outcomes that we're not that pleased with, but we have to understand come because of severe disabilities? Yes, they will drop out of school. Yes, they will have somewhat lower employment rates than others because of the very severity of their disabilities.
Well, I appreciate your perspective, and the reason that we're holding this hearing today is to ask some questions that often don't get asked. We've tried to work in a number of areas related to processes and really understanding how to help these young people the best way possible so they can go back to work. And I think the one mistake we don't want to make is assume, well, because this has been the issue in the past in the data, we therefore should continue to insist that we won't address the root causes of that. Rather, I think what the point of asking for many different perspectives is to assure that we look at creative ways to address that, to make sure that very worthy young people like Will and his family receive support. And for those who may never be able to make that transition, we understand that. But on the other hand, I've seen some great success personally in the professional world with young people with incredible disabilities that have been able to move into meaningful work. And I think it comes back to community involvement, work in the front lines, and asking questions like we're asking today. Whether we all agree with each other or not, there's great benefit in that.
And we do,
And with-
Mr. Chairman,
and
have some
reclaiming my-
specific recommendations in our written testimony, which I
Mr.
won't
St-
repeat here.
You'll have plenty of opportunity, I'm sure, to share
Sure.
those as the other members of the panel ask questions. And with that, I'll defer now to Ranking Member Doggett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask to be made part of our record an excellent article in today's U.S. Today, Cutting SSI Would Only Hurt Children, written by Dr. Susan Parrish of Brandeis University and Dr. James Perrin, a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. And just reading a couple of lines from that report, I think we've had testimony in my opening statement to this effect, but SSI serves only low-income children with the most severe mental and physical impairments. Its medical and financial eligibility requirements are so strict that only 1.6% of the children in the United States and fewer than 10% of kids with disabilities receive SSI. In fact, the overwhelming majority of children who apply for SSI are denied. Congress should look for ways to support our nation's most vulnerable children and families instead of painting a target on their backs in the name of deficit reduction. That certainly summarizes my own feeling about this. I'm against scams. I think everybody on this committee is against scams. I'm against them whether they're committed by giant pharmaceutical companies at the cost of tens of millions of dollars to our public service programs, or they're committed by one young woman who goes off to have drugs with her boyfriend. And it seems to me that the focus ought to be on getting at the scams rather than on denying benefits to many deserving families. We have one way of getting at scams under the system, and that is the disability reviews. Unfortunately, under the Bush administration, the resources for those disability reviews were significantly reduced. And finally, under the current administration, we've begun to increase the review process. That's where the focus ought to be, rather than across-the-board cuts. I find the testimony Dr. Burkhauser has left, the suggestion that because the states have done such a great job reducing benefits in temporary assistance for needy families, in cutting the level of those benefits and affording them to fewer and fewer families, let's let them do the same thing for families with children with severe physical or mental disabilities. It's a little like the argument that some people have made that because the states do so little with Medicaid in our nursing homes, let's let them administer Medicare too and save some money at the expense of seniors and individuals with disabilities. I think that's very backward thinking. I know what will happen in Elgin, Texas, to this beautiful set of twins who suffer from autism. They'll get the same kind of second-rate support from the state of Texas that the state of Texas provides through the Medicaid program for those who rely on it, who can barely get by, who can't get all the prescriptions that their doctors provide to them. Mr. Stein, what would be the effect, as you see it, in states across the country for these families if we just turn all this, we use, I believe, the term devolution, let's just give it all back to the states instead of maintaining any federal program with reference to SSI?
Well, I think there would be terrible consequences, Mr. Doggett. There would be a lack of equity. There would be a lack of minimum standards. There would be the very subjectivity that perhaps Mr. Burkhauser is concerned about. When you have a national system like the Social Security-run Social Security system for kids and adults, you have national standards, you have quality controls in place. In fact, the quality control accuracy rate for decision-making in child disability cases is something like 97%. Now, there is a kind of myth out there that this is the new welfare. And that's almost a defamation of the SSI Kids program. And the assumption that suddenly when you reduce Latanophrols, all those kids go on to SSI. And that, I think you've heard a little theme of that, about that by a couple of people at this table. But despite those allegations that SSI is or has become a general welfare program, the truth is that being poor is not enough to qualify for SSI. To get SSI, you also have to have a very severe disability. And the Congress in 1996, in the welfare legislation then, upped the severity standard greatly.
Let me just ask you one other question that's been referred to in testimony, I think by Dr. Roberts and by others here. Looking at the testimony that is on file with the committee today from Dr. James Scully on behalf of the American Psychiatric Association, that testimony indicates in response to this issue of, well, aren't the people out there just passing out drugs to these kids so they can qualify for this program? He says that the medication treatment for disorders like ADHD actually reduces the likelihood of eligibility for SSI. Is that correct?
That's exactly true.
Mr. Stein, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Perhaps you can continue with another.
Time has expired, and part of the reason for needing to expedite, we're going to have a vote coming in the next 15 to 30 minutes. And I'd just like to make sure that every panelist has the opportunity to ask. If you could give that response to the committee in writing, we'd be very grateful for that.
Yes, I was in mid-sentence, Mr. Chairman, and I would, may I just complete that sentence?
Depending.
I thank you for that. I promise
I
not to go.
I tell you what we're going to do, since the last sentence was a minute and a half long. I think we'll let it come back in writing. I share equal passion for helping young people, and have volunteered and worked in this space for nearly 30 years, so I think that we can have some common ground in this. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be pretty quick to let everyone on the panel have a chance to probe questions. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to get back to this issue of the timely reviews, because even Mr. Stein had noted, I think back in January regarding children on SSI, that existing law already requires disability reviews every 3 years where improvement is likely. But the data really does suggest that those reviews have not actually been happening in years. So, for example, the Social Security Administration Inspector General recently reported that although required by statute, SSA failed to complete 79% of scheduled child reviews, resulting in an estimated $1.4 billion in overpayments. So there's obviously concern about this issue on a bipartisan basis. In fact, in the Budget Control Act, which we just adopted in August, we provided more resources for these reviews, as well as other program integrity activities to the tune of about $623 million for 2012. Mr. Bertoni, you also noted in your statement and made some comments that SSA does not appear to be conducting childhood CDRs in a very timely manner. In your opinion, how vital is it for SSA to conduct childhood CDRs, and in what ways could SSA better target those efforts?
Certainly. The CDRs they are conducting, as I said earlier, are for age 18 redeterminations, as well as the low birth weight babies. But there is a vast range of other mental impairments that they're not getting to. We do know that many of them are increasing and represent a significant portion of the roles. Speech delay, 21%. ADHD, 26%, autism, 11%. That's in excess of 50% of the roles are within those three impairments. They're getting very few CDRs. And again, some of those cases potentially could have medically improved. The science says that is a possibility. A number of those are probably listed as medical improvement expected. So I think you're foregoing an opportunity, I think, not just to save taxpayer dollars, but to put children who are medically impaired on a different track, to a track towards productivity and integration towards something other than lifelong Social Security benefits.
So knowing there's that opportunity there, do you believe that SSA has a plan for how to use the monies in the Budget Control Act that we just passed a couple of months ago to target these reviews more efficiently and effectively?
I do know they're concerned about certain trends in the caseload, certain impairments, and they're eyeing it very closely. I do not believe there's a specific plan to get to the existing backlog or what they would do going forward.
Mr. Chairman, I just think we're going to have to monitor this because we're all looking at stretched resources, and there's broad agreement here that these reviews, timely reviews, are critical. So I'll yield back my time to move on.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. McDermott from Washington State for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me this hearing has got two issues in it, and where you can't deal with both of them. One is the effect of poverty on poor kids and what we've done. And Dr. Burkhauser and Dr. Wittenberg both talked about that. We ought to have a hearing about that and what we ought to do about it. But the more important issue here, it seems to me, is what Dr. Roberts says. Dr. Roberts says that child psychiatrists are fraudulently putting children on SSI. That she says in her testimony, because diagnosing a child with psychiatric condition is based almost exclusively on the verbal report by a child's parent, it's easy for the doctor to arrive at the wrong conclusion. Now that would imply that you don't examine the kid. I'm a child psychiatrist, you're a child psychiatrist, you saw that child and you made the diagnosis on the basis of reports, but also what you saw in front of you. For you to imply that any kid out of the 1.2 million kids that are on SSI in this country were put there by somebody who didn't see the child is an absolute accusation of fraud. And I know you went on Oprah and you've been on CNN, so I know you've got the ear of the media. That's why I'm taking you on, because you're in the media here. And the fact is that I'd like to hear, did you ever report a doctor for doing such a thing? Because it's against the ethics of the American Psychiatric Association to make a diagnosis without seeing the patient. You know that. I can't make it. I can't say what I think of Mr. Davis' psychiatric condition because I haven't examined him. Everybody understands that.
If I could interrupt, I would only agree to that if I have reciprocity with the gentleman from Washington State.
Well,
too.
I make my point. You don't, the business about making a decision about Ms. Shivo by Dr. Frist, making a decision about somebody in Florida on a breathing machine when you haven't seen the patient is malpractice and it's unethical. So now you're accusing doctors of doing that. Give me an example of someone you know by name that saw a patient or didn't see a patient and signed a paper and said they're eligible for SSI.
I just, in respect of HIPAA, I would ask that you not name any individuals that you're citing if you have those records.
Well, you can give me a false name like Sarah, right?
Thank you, Ms. McDermott, for opportunity. I don't know how you came to the conclusion that I said that because the diagnosis is made primarily on the report by the parent, that the child is never seen. Evaluations of children, as it's done in practice, it's very nice that there is so much testimony here that getting a child onto SSI is so difficult and the requirements are so strict and stringent. They are not. In practice, now I don't know how many people here actually treat children still today in poverty and see and help them apply for SSI every week, because I do. Every week. Filling out SSA forms.
How long do you spend with these kids? 2 minutes?
See, that's
or 3,
the difference.
Or
that's
an hour?
The difference. I spend 2 hours or more, and my colleagues spend 20 or 5. And that's the problem.
20 minutes or 5?
5 minutes.
How do you
right.
know that?
How do I know that? Because the doctors tell me that, and the patients who have seen these doctors report that to me.
Have
the
you
doctors
reported them
actually,
for an ethics violation for seeing a patient for 5 minutes and then
it's
going?
a common practice, Mr. McDermott, a common practice.
Common
and yes, I
practice.
report it to the supervisors at the county, and they tell me forget about it. For example, in the case of Sarah, when I denied her, her mother came back a year later and said, my house burned down,
No,
we
you're
need the
giving
money.
me one example. You,
Oh, I
I'm
can
sorry.
give you hundreds of
let me tell you.
examples. Hundreds.
You're trying to draw you're trying to draw a general policy.
No, I'm
on
not.
Yes, you
no,
are.
I'm not. I'm trying to say there is a lot of fraud and abuse in the system, and it needs to be fixed. I'm not referring to Will. I'm talking
And
about
what have you
kids
done
like
to
Sarah.
repair it? Where have you used the organizations that one would use to repair that fraud and abuse? What have you done?
I report that. I write books, I write articles, and I report it to supervisors. What else can I do? I testify before a subcommittee.
Are you
That's the
a member of
best I
AMA?
can do.
Are you a member of the American Psychiatric Association?
No, I let my membership lapse because they're making statements like they did that completely ignores what happens in the trenches for those of us who are actually treating these children. They make these blanket statements as if everyone is getting a very strict review. They are not. After Sarah was denied,
You're making
her
the
mother
blanket
came back
statements.
into me.
Excuse me.
No, I'm not
That's
making
my
a blanket
time.
statement. Oh, sorry.
You're making the
Actually,
statement.
it's now my time. Thank you.
Our time.
I appreciate the spirited dialogue on this issue with my friend from Washington, with whom I've worked on many legislative initiatives, and yours, Dr. Roberts, as well. We do have a copy of your book, as among others. But now I would like to defer to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I truly do want to thank all the panelists that are here. I thank the chairman for pulling this together. You know, back in September, we had really a hearing on the SSI program for adults, and I'm just happy here that we're looking at the same issue with children. And one of the things that strikes me is, before we get in the weeds, we have to kind of look at the outcomes. And really, what in the big picture, long term, are we doing? What are we creating? How are we impacting these people's lives? And so that's kind of the thrust of where I'd like to go with the questioning. And you know, we talked about the incentives in September for adults on vocational rehabilitation and how to help them re-enter the workforce. And I think that should be a goal, is how do we have people feel a part of our society, have them be engaged in work that they enjoy, work that they feel of value to. And so a lot of what I've heard here today seems that we have barriers and disincentives to that direction. And so, Dr. Wittenberg, you know, from your research, you know, there's very low rates of enrollment in vocational rehabilitation services on these youth that are transitioning. And you mentioned several demonstration projects. And I guess one of the brief questions is the youth transition demonstration. What is the theory behind that?
That's a very good question, Mr. Berg. And the youth transition demonstration is one of the demonstrations that I'm very optimistic about, because I feel like it's asking the right questions, which is, how can we promote the long-term outcomes of these youth? It looks at the exact poor outcomes that I put in that slide, and it says, what do we know about best practices in terms of delivering employment supports to youth with disabilities? What do we know about incentives that may affect youth's choices regarding the labor market? And it combines a series of intervention approaches. And I think one of the key points of it, Mr. Berg, is that it is designed to be a customized approach to meet the individual needs of the youth. It's not a standard system. So the youth transition demonstration is operating in several sites across the country. And sites have developed their own models around these general parameters. And it's a flexible sort of model. It's too early to tell what the impacts of YTD are. But demonstrations like YTD are really important because they're changing the way that we're approaching youth with disabilities, and the way we should be approaching, quite frankly, all youth, because the outcomes of these populations are not acceptable currently.
Well, then the next question is a follow-up, really relates to the high school graduation.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just stunned by, again, the statistics where, you know, 2 out of 5 don't have a diploma, 4 out of 5 are not working, 1 out of 5 is arrested.
Yep.
Again, it seems like there's some things that are failing here. And so, you know, back to you, and even within the program where we have people receiving survivor benefits, children, they must remain in school. So I guess my question to you is, you know, does this current policy undermine what we're trying to do, and should this be a requirement in the system for the education?
I think that's an excellent question, Mr. Berg, and I do believe that we should be putting requirements into the system that help youth achieve all the outcomes that they need to achieve. Now, all these requirements are not going to be appropriate for all youth. I mean, some youth may be homebound, but I think that we can move beyond a one benefit fits all needs model, and if we can customize supports to better meet the needs of these youth. And I want to be clear, I'm not advocating cutting the Child SSI program in any way. It provides a vital source of low-income support. I'm suggesting that we rethink the way the benefits are provided. So youth, getting back to your question, so that when we come to a youth, they don't say to themselves, look, I'm afraid to work because it might jeopardize my benefit status.
Right.
So,
Well, that's kind of in the bigger picture here. I think the one-size-fits-all strategy from the top down is a problem. I think the states are the innovators. The states can come up with solutions. And, you talked really about, again, I think the federal program restricts innovation at the state level and trying to be more effective and better outcomes for children. And so I guess kind of my question is this integration you talked about with the states, if they can have more flexibility, I understand the benefits. What are the issues we should be aware of if we're going to transition more of those decisions on the state level?
well, the first issue you should be aware of is we don't know what works. And so part of the history of the SSI program is that it became a federal program because states were having a problem serving people with disabilities.
Dr. Wittenberg, if I could suggest, if you could complete that answer for the record, that would be helpful. I hate to be the traffic cop this morning, but knowing that we have this impending vote, I want to make sure that all our members have the opportunity to question.
I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Lewis from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank members of the panel for being here. Mr. Chairman, I would like for Mrs. Bentley to come before the witness table. Mrs. Bentley, thank you.
Press the button on your microphone.
Thank you and Will for being here. Can you tell the subcommittee something about your son Will's disability and about how SSI benefits have helped you better care for him? Do you think SSI benefits have made a positive difference for Will? What improvement has he made since receiving SSI? What would happen to Will and your family if you did not have assistance from the SSI program?
Thank you. Will has a seizure disorder that when he has seizures, and most of the time they're at night, he does have some during the daytime, but he has them when he sleeps, and he loses skills that he's learned during the day. So if it's in his short-term memory, Will may not get it back for some time. And he was unable to feed himself, unable to communicate. He communicated with his hands. We learned how to tell stories. And then he learned how to talk after we started controlling the seizures somewhat. But they're in the part of his brain that controls speech. So that was huge for him. For Will to be able to dress himself and be able to read that he can today, he's learning so much. And feeding himself and being able to talk to us and to tell us things. His speech still has delays, but Will can say so much, and he can communicate in so many ways. With the SSI program and being able to have those benefits, it's brought so many things to Will, resources that I couldn't even imagine doing without. I don't think that Will would be where he's at today if I had not had that opportunity. These programs just really are priceless to families. To have the support, the doctors, to be able to buy his medicines and not worry, to be able to take him to therapy and get a good home program that I could use so that when Will is in the community or he's at home, we're able to find ways to help him be a part of that. I'm not sure if I've answered all your questions.
Well, thank you. You're doing very well, Mrs. Bentley. Thank you so much. How will you respond to some of the comments from the witness here today, particularly those who claim that the childhood SSI program is not working, that it is devastatingly corrupt, it is a menace to children, and a tragic misuse of public funds? How does it make you feel when you have to read these type of allegations when you're trying to do the best for your son, Will?
It makes me want to ask you guys to come home with me and spend some time with me, some time with Will, and to see how great his life is. The opportunities that we're giving him are priceless. I have huge hopes and dreams for my son, and I am working with him to help do that. If SSI was not available to our family, I could not do that. I couldn't give him an opportunity. Someday, my son's going to be a productive part of the community. He's not going to be someone who's there just getting a check. And right now, that gives us an opportunity for me to be there and really be enriched in his life, not just on the sidelines. I'm here with him, making sure that he has a future. And I put my career back where it needs to be right now. I can always pick that up later. If I don't make the changes in Will's life today, if I don't invest my time in him, I am never going to change the outcome for him. He's going to be the same way his entire life. But no, I know that Will has a chance because I'm not going to quit. I'm going to be there for him and every other child that is tucked in my heart today as I come here before you.
Mrs. Bentley, I appreciate you saying what you say. It's my philosophy. It's very simple that you cannot give up or give in or give out. And thank you for you standing up for Will and speaking up for this program. Mr. Chairman, you know, in spite of all of the difficulties that we have as a country, I don't think this is the time to cut this program and try to balance the budget on the back of the most disabled children and young people in our society. We can do better. Thank you very much, Ms. Bentley.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and you know, as we move forward, I think one of the highlights that speaks to me and points all the more to why Congressman Neal and I requested the GAO report in the first place is the Sarahs of the world are the ones who take away the opportunities for the Wills of the world. And nobody, I think, has implied or remotely suggested cutting the budget on the backs of the needy. I think what we're trying to do is understand broken processes so that we can repair them and improve the quality of our systems overall. And that unemotional focus in a very emotional situation, I believe, is critical and nonpartisan in nature. Just as we were able to have such a successful reform in the child welfare reauthorization, I would hope as we move forward with these programs we can accomplish the same thing. With that, I recognize Mr. Reed for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I strongly associate myself with your words because I think, Mrs. Bentley, I'm a new member of Congress, and everybody up here recognizes my son's name is Will. I have 2 nephews that have autism, one low functioning, one high functioning. And the system needs to be secured. And I hope you take some comfort in knowing that we all up here recognize the system needs to be here for you and for Will. But what we need to focus on is making sure that the abuses and the program is sustainable and the abuses are weeded out so that it will be here in the future for Will and the future Wills. And so I come at here from a new perspective of trying to look forward. And when I hear my colleagues who have been here for quite some time talk about how the federal government has done it so well and we shouldn't give it to the states or we shouldn't experiment with things at the state level, I just go to the scoreboard. I mean, I look at Social Security, bankrupt, 2036. Medicare, bankrupt, 2019. Medicaid, every county in my district, I represent 8 counties in New York State, 100% of the property tax levy goes to Medicaid. It's driving my seniors out of the homes that their parents built because they can't pay the property tax bill. So I came here to make a difference. I came here not to talk about how President Bush cut the program, but President Obama is restoring the program. That partisan stuff, I'm tired of it. So we're here to ask the questions of how do we strengthen this program? How do we, and I'll start backwards. You know, Mr. Stein, I would hope your goal is to have recommendations to us today to remove disabilities so that children can go on and become productive so that they don't have the need for SSI going forward. Give me one recommendation from you, sir, that would enhance that goal of removing the disability. And then I want to go to Mr. Bertoni about how we reform and go after the fraud. And then I want to go to Dr. Roberts to go to the qualifying events to make sure they're objective and not subjective.
Thank you,
one
Mr.
solution.
Reed.
Thank you.
I mean, we have a number at the end of our written testimony. One that stands out is improving vocational rehabilitation services for those youth who are under 18 and those who transition after 18 onto SSI. The voc rehab services are very minimal these days to non-existent. They could be much more proactive. That's a state agency. So this is state action.
So you recommend a state action in
And
that area?
we recommend that there be improved and pumped up and targeted services by state voc rehab agencies that work with Social Security and with other federal and state agencies to really assist kids who are older kids in teenagers and those transitioning after 18. Indeed, though, you don't have an automatic ride after 18. 1/3 of the SSI kids are terminated at age 18.
Thank you, Mr.
And that's a population that also needs voc rehab services
That's a very
as well.
reasonable recommendation. I appreciate you
thanks.
giving that thoughtful comment. Mr. Bertoni, from your perspective, what is one of the top areas we could target to go after the fraud and abuse in the system?
Aside from the income and asset, there's a lot that can be done on the income and assets with the parents, but that's not the subject of this hearing. But from a medical standpoint, I think really targeting those cases that are most likely to improve, doing the appropriate reviews, and identifying those children who can move, as you said, to that different track, that more the productive track, is key. If you don't, there is the likelihood, if it's not fraud, it could be abuse. Whereby folks will linger on the rolls for many years, well past their eligibility period, and that's a cost to the taxpayer. So, if we don't want to touch the front end, which folks can argue whether it's subjective or not so subjective, we really need to look at the existing folks in the rolls, and making sure that they're truly eligible for benefits. And the way you get to that is to doing the reviews that you're required to do.
The reviews. Now, on the front end, Dr. Roberts, any recommendations as to how to make this more of an objective standard?
It would be very hard because, like I said, when children are being assessed, it's really their parents' report. I am not speaking of children like Will. I am not talking about the children I have helped onto the SSI rolls who definitely needed the help, their family needed the help. But the system has to be reformed in terms of the way the money is used by those who receive it. Regular reviews are a good start, but if the patient is still being seen very quickly.
I see my time's expired, so maybe we can talk offline, or maybe written recommendations as to creating a more objective standard from the gatekeeper perspective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Neal, my partner in the original request, will have the last word today.
Just a couple of thoughts. First, how difficult it is to have these conversations.
What's that?
How really hard it is, because they become so charged when you really are trying to discern evidence that might support Mrs. Bentley and her family. And that's what the goal ought to be here. That's the priority. Now, Social Security is not going bankrupt in 2036. I've not heard one actuarial suggestion that that's the case. Dr. Wittenberg, I believe, is correct. The reason that the federal government took over the initiative was because the states were ineffectual in their approach. And the suggestion that I offered earlier, and I hope that the subcommittee and the full committee might entertain, is the idea of having the Institute of Medicine take a look at the program. I do think that Mr. Bertoni has raised a reasonable point when he says there's a difference between fraud and abuse. There's a chasm there. And abuse clearly could be perhaps an overworked physician suggesting, well, medication becomes the first option. And there are educators in Springfield and Holyoke, Massachusetts, that I have enormous regard for. I've known them my whole life, professionally and personally. And they have suggested to me that this is a worthwhile examination based upon the challenges they face every day in the classroom. And there is evidence that the roles have grown. And if it's for children like Will, they should grow. If it's in an abusive state, then we have an obligation just to examine it. And I don't think we ought to be afraid of the outcomes that the Institute of Medicine might produce. And I would hope we could all rally around the suggestion and responsibility we have to ensure that people that need the benefit get it, and the people that don't need the benefit are removed from it. That's a simple equation. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate very much you allowing me to participate today.
Mr. Neal, may I just Mr. Neal, may I just add something to your response, which is I think we fully agree with that, and I think the heart of what you're saying is the need not to rush in haste. I think that we need to wait for the GAO study, which is in its, quote, preliminary observation stage today. We need an Institute of Medicine study. And I think the danger, as Dr. Wittenberg says in his statement, is to rush like what was done 15 years ago. He states in 2 places in his testimony that there were media reports at that time in the mid-90s which were later proved to be totally untrue about abuse, about parents coaching, and all of this, and that fueled changes in the law in this Congress in 1996 that he says at pages 3 and 4 of his testimony were unwise and made things worse. And he's urging, and I think we all in this room I should be in agreement that this is not a program that we should rush into changing. We should look at the studies, we should take our time, because the lives and health of too many children are at stake for hasty action.
And if I could just say for the record, I would say the welfare reforms made in 1996 were not evidence-based changes. They were made in haste. So I don't want to put a judgment on whether they were good or bad changes. But certainly when you look at the outcomes that we're seeing today, I think it does cause us to look at what's going on in the SSI program.
Does the gentleman yield back? Good. I thank the gentleman. I thank all of our witnesses who came to join us today for this discussion. If members have additional questions, they'll be submitting them directly to you all in writing. What I would ask is that the witnesses submit a copy of their response to the committee for the record so that it can be shared with all members and staff. We appreciate your time that you've invested in preparation, especially the Bentleys for coming from my home area in Covington, Kentucky. And with that, this hearing stands adjourned.
When you handed me that, I was like, I wonder if you had one.
No, I did.